my friend, and welcome to the study for some beautiful, relaxing sounds and books today, and of course a little bit of history, just a little bit. Today we're looking at grammar. What is a grammar? Most people, and rightly so, will associate grammar with something like this. Little rules and formats for language, for writing and speaking. Parts of speech, sentence structure, verb conjugation. And truly, we can see that this is true for every language on the planet. I have some examples here of some of the ones that I refer to regularly. There you see some have tables, and yet others will have even exercises in them to help you understand how language is used. Another one: spelling, grammar, vocabulary, conjugation, and style. Style and orthography regularly come into grammar. And here's one for German. It's used so much that you can see it's come off of the binding. Imperative, strong verbs, weak adjectives. So we have, in essence, rules and formats for language and grammar. Why do we need grammar? Why do we learn grammar and refer to it? Well, it comes down to, as people, as human beings, we want to communicate. We want to convey our thoughts, our feelings, our ideas, and our dreams and imagination to others. And we want to do this clearly and effectively. But there's more to grammar than just the basic rules and accepted structure of language. Grammar indeed began as the philosophy of language, and after the advent of the printing press, languages began to be affected more quickly. And here I have 2 volumes what you might recognize from about a year ago, the grammar of Port Royal. This is from the 18th century, about the middle 18th century. It's about 1758. It's when a lot of grammars were being written and consolidated, but not as you would expect today of a modern grammar. This one is more of a philosophy, and we're going to learn a little bit of the background of this new method of learning with facility the Latin tongue. As you watch me maintain these old volumes, because it's been about a year since I've treated the leather, and it's weathered quite well, but I've been unable to find someone who can repair this to the standard I want just yet, but I'm still talking to different bookbinders to see what I can do without having to redo the entire covers and binding, because I like to keep those if at all possible. So I'm going to use my Renaissance microcrystalline wax polish and this one from the Museum Restoration. It's a leather restorer. Some nice lid sounds. I like this one. And I'm going to use this very soft microfiber sponge for the books. The other side is abrasive, so I won't be using that. So I'll be treating the leather binding and covers of these books as I tell you about the Port Royal philosophy of grammar. The ancient Greeks were the first to write grammars as a tool for the study of literature. By the 1st century BC, Greek grammars were further developed in order to preserve the purity of their language. Dionysius Thrax of Alexandria wrote The Art of Grammar, in which he analyzed literary texts in terms of letters, syllables, and the 8 parts of speech. The format of this grammar was emulated in different ways throughout history and into the 18th and 19th centuries. Dionysius saw grammar as imperios, an experimental knowledge of the uses of language as generally current among poets and prose writers. And he divided his grammar into 6 parts. The first would be reading of prosody. The second, the explanation of language according to poetical figures. The third, dialectical peculiarities and allusions, so the historiae. And fourth, etymology. Fifth, analogies. And sixth was a criticism of different poetical productions, the noblest part of the grammatic art. Later, the Romans adopted this Greek grammatical system, as they did with many Greek things, applying it to their Latin language, and also seeking to protect their own language from the decay or the perceived decay. Language of Homer had been the model for the Greeks and Alexandrians, and for the Romans it was the works of Cicero and Virgil who set the standard for Latin. The works of Donatus in the 4th century AD and Priscin in the 6th century AD, the most important Latin grammarians, were widely used to teach Latin grammar during the European Middle Ages, when education was conducted in Latin, and Latin grammar became the foundation of the liberal arts curriculum at all universities. This curriculum, of course, was based on philosophy, but not as we know philosophy today. Rather, that philosophy was the root of the learning of every discipline. It will come then as no surprise that grammarians of the mid-13th to 14th centuries, who viewed language as a reflection of reality, looked to philosophy for explanations of grammatical rules. These modistae sought one universal grammar that would serve as a means of understanding the nature of being, a de rerum natura for the unity of all things. In 17th century France, a group of grammarians from Port-Royal, a Cistercian abbey in Magny-les-Amours, in the Vallée de Chevreuse, southwest of Paris, established in 1204, and responsible for having launched a number of culturally important institutions, were also interested in the idea of a universal grammar. Unlike their Greek and Latin forebears, the Port-Royal grammarians did not make a study of literary language, but instead proposed that usage should be dictated by the actual speech of living languages. Thus, they came to be known as the first transformational grammarians. By 1700, grammars of 61 vernacular languages had been printed. The study of grammatical theory has been of interest to philosophers, anthropologists, psychologists, and literary critics over the centuries. Today, grammar exists as a field within linguistics, though it still retains a connection to these other disciplines. But for many people, however, grammar still merely refers to the body of rules one must know in order to speak or write correctly. The Port-Royal grammar, originally Grammaire générale et raisonnée, contenant les fondements de l'art de parler expliqué d'une manière claire et naturelle. General and rational grammar, containing the fundamentals of the art of speaking, explained in a clear and natural manner, was a milestone in the analysis and philosophy of language. It was published in 1660 by Antoine Arnaud and Claude Lancelot, and was the linguistic counterpart of the Port-Royal logic that was published in 1662, both named after the Jansenist monastery of Port-Royal des Champs, where the authors worked. The Port-Royal grammar became used as a standard textbook in the study of language, and remained so until the early 19th century. Arnaud and Lancelot's approach to language is historical, comparative, and philosophical. Discussing the essence of French, they give examples from Latin, Greek, Arabic, Hebrew, Spanish, Italian, and German. Their work is influenced by the modistae, those modists who studied speculative grammar in the Middle Ages. Other influences include Andreas Helwig's etymology, Francis Bacon's Universal Language Project, and works by philosophers including René Descartes and Blaise Pascal. A core argument of Arnaud and Lancelot's general and rational grammar is that language reveals human thought structures which are based on the logic of predication. All thought structures are based on logic and refrain from outside judgment. All languages are similar because there is only one logic. Their connection between logic and grammar has much to do with the idea of the vocabulary that concludes the logic of a statement, that arguments within arguments lead to a tacit, logical deduction. Not surprisingly, the Port-Royal grammar has for centuries been the subject of debates relating to the demarcation problem between humanities and natural sciences. Arnaud and Lancelot's 1803 French editor, Monsieur Claude Bernard Petitot, explains that in the tradition of rational grammar, language is seen as a man-made invention. But the Enlightenment philosophy was that God created man to be social and rational, and these two natural characteristics gave rise to his need to construct a language to communicate his thoughts to others. Petitot thus disputed Jean-Jacques Rousseau's assertion that innate language does not represent rationalism, positing that in order for language to have arisen rationally, it must have been created by means of human reasoning. This kind of debate remains insoluble today, and goes on even as we speak now. Here we have the Port-Royal example, and it is translated from the French into English for learning the Latin language. New method of learning with facility the Latin tongue, containing the rules of genders, declensions, preterites, syntax, quantity and Latin accents, digested in the clearest and concisest order, enlarged with variety of solid remarks necessary not only for a perfect knowledge of the Latin tongue, but likewise for understanding the best authors, extracted from the ablest writers on this language, with a treatise on Latin poetry, translated from the French of the Messieurs de Port-Royal, revised, corrected, and improved in 2 volumes. London, printed for J. Norse at the Lamb, opposite Catherine Street, in the Strand, 1758. The preface, showing the additions that have been made to this work in the second, and in the last edition, extracted from the best modern grammarians. So here in our preface, the author tells us why he finds this Latin grammar necessary and the improvements he's made to this edition. This new method, having met with the most favourable reception upon its being first published, and moreover, having had the good fortune to contribute towards His Majesty's improvement in the Roman languages, of all others the most useful, I thought it incumbent upon me to consider before I gave a second edition of it, whether I might not make some alterations or additions that would render it more clear and comprehensive than when it was first sent abroad, which I have most carefully endeavoured to perform in this last edition. And, as I am naturally aware from all the little disputes of grammarians, which, as Quintilian excellently observes, serve only to perplex and to weaken the understanding, I have been at the pains of pursuing the best authors, both ancient and modern, who have wrote concerning this art, the inlet to all others. But I flatter myself that the solid and judicious remarks of those authors which I have illustrated here by examples, and confirmed by authorities from the ancients, will sufficiently demonstrate with what reason the same Quintilian said, that they are very much mistaken who make a jest of grammar, as a mean and contemptible art. Since, in respect to eloquence, it is the same as the foundation in regard to a building. Unless this be deeply laid, the whole superstructure must tumble down. This art, he goes on, is necessary to children, agreeable to those in advanced years, and serves for an amusement to retired persons who apply themselves to polite literature. And it may be said that of all arts it has this particular advantage, to be possessed of more real and solid value than of glitter and outward show. For which reason he adds, what I hope this work will fully evince, that there are a great many things in grammar which not only help to form the minds of beginners, but likewise to exercise and to try the capacities of the most learned. And indeed, we ought to set a very high value upon an art which, at the same time that it shows how to distinguish the property and natural force of each part of speech, and the reason of the great variety of expressions, makes us see the various significations of terms which frequently arise from their different connections, and directs us to the meaning of several important passages. For even the most trifling things become great when they can be rendered subservient to those of a higher nature. I hope that what I have here hinted will have its use in pointing out the object we ought to aim at in this new method, which is to lead our pupils gradually, by means of a solid and exact knowledge of grammar, to understand the best authors, so that by a judicious and well-chosen imitation they may form to themselves a polite style, and rise at length to a noble and manly eloquence, the great end of grammatical institution. So, my friend, there we have our Latin grammars from Port Royal, Old and New. I hope you've enjoyed this little sojourn into the world of grammar philosophy, and that you found it relaxing. Be good to yourself, my friend. Be kind to others, and, as always, be extraordinary.